Really taken much time on this program to talk about the Kansas Jayhawks, but I gotta tell you, dude, I'm very high on Kansas this year, and there are a couple different reasons for that. I think first and foremost, it's important to kind of conceptualize just how challenging Kansas football has been over the past decade before Lance Leipold came in. During that time between 2010 and 2021, they posted a 23-118 record, which which two of those seasons were winless. And you had some really difficult times. I mean, I go back when, I was in high school, and as a kid, there were coaches such as Les Miles and Charlie Weiss, and you kind of sat there and said to yourself, this is not a good idea. And it showed on the football field too, as Kansas already has the reputation of being a basketball school. And on top of that, they really haven't won any sort of conference championships or even kind of come close to flirting with that since the 2007 season with Maggiano back in 2000. That was like in the late 2000s there. And for the most part, they're in a really good spot right now. You have Lance Leipold, who in my opinion is one of the best football coaches in the entire country, coming back for his fifth year. You're riding the wave of momentum. They beat multiple ranked opponents last year, winning their last three. And they beat three ranked opponents. They knocked off a top 10 BYU, and they beat Colorado, and they beat Arizona State. So when you put all that together, there's some reason to be excited. And when you look at their roster this year, you say to yourself, there's a pretty talented roster here. Yes, there's always going to be a little bit of turnover when it comes to the season too, but what they got going for them is they got a number of players coming back, a number of different playmakers coming back. But most importantly, you have Jaylon Daniels coming back, who I think is one of the most underappreciated players in the entire country. And in many ways, he really was somewhat underappreciated a lot because Kansas had Devin Neal as their running back too. And if I had Devin Neal, yeah, I would just be feeding him the rock 25, 30 times a game, let him rush for 1,000 to 2,500 or 1,500 yards. I forget the exact stat on how many that he had to. And also a total cheat code in college football 25, by the way, for those of you guys who play. But you sit there and you look at this Kansas team, and I'm not going to sit there and call this a make or break year because I think that term gets overused. But I think this is the point in time where I think first and foremost, we need to see Kansas in a bowl game. I think there's no way around that. They finished year 5-7, got off to a strong start. And in many ways, there was just a lot of expectation for them last year. And now they're kind of at the point now where they're in a similar spot, maybe not as high as 2024, but you sit there and you have the 56th ranked recruiting class. You finished a number of renovations within the athletics program, particularly in the football program. David Booth donated tens of millions of dollars to help facilitate all of that. So now you have another piece to sit there and be able to recruit and bring in guys in the transfer portal and stick your hat in the NIL field. And they're always going to have the reputation to some degree of quote unquote being a basketball school. But what a lot of people don't also keep in mind too is Kansas has a ton of history as a football program. They're one of the oldest football programs in all of college football. And by the way, their field was built in 1921 too. So there's a lot of unrecognized history that goes into Kansas football. Now, obviously, a lot of it is, at least in the immediate history, relatively negative. And granted, I've talked about how difficult it can be for them to recruit in a place like Kansas. I mean, not a lot of people sit there and say, "Oh yeah, I'd love to live in Kansas one day." Not a lot of people sit there and say that. However, when you have a guy like Lance Leipold, and by the way, I would recommend watching RJ Young's interview with him last season. I think it was really, really telling, and you can just feel the passion and the commitment and the excitement that he brings to Lawrence as well. But there's a ton of talented guys on this team. I mean, you can look at the bottom there. I mean, I particularly highlighted some of the guys on the offensive defensive line, such as Bryce Foster, Kobe Bynes, Dean Miller, Tommy Dunn, all these guys who I think are going to be a monumental part in not only protecting Jaylon Daniels, but also bringing that continuity that I think is difficult to find now in college football, especially when you're sitting there and you're kind of saying to yourself, you don't even know which guys are going to be there from year to year because so many guys are moving around. But just a little bit of context in terms of the offensive side of the ball, because in my opinion, that's really what Kansas's bread and butter has been under Lance Leipold and a lot of success that they've had. So in terms of the regular season, they were number 10 in the Big 12 in terms of scoring offense with 29.7 points, and they were sixth with over 420 yards per game. So they never had a problem with scoring points and never had a problem with being explosive. It just got to a point where they were just so flat at the beginning of the season, and by the time they were able to turn it around and build some momentum, it was too late. And yes, they played a little bit of spoiler to BYU and Colorado and some of these programs towards the end of the season. However, it's just too little too late at that point. And yes, you finished off the season strong, and yes, you had that continuity with now is going to be a senior quarterback and Jaylon Daniels, and that's exciting and everything. But at the same time, too, you're going to have that point now where there's going to be so much more pressure on him now that you don't have Devin Neal anymore. So I anticipate them throwing the ball a lot more this year and really kind of going for some more explosive plays, relying on this wide receiver room to get a little bit more done. And when I sit there and look at this schedule, I have to tell you, dude, as somebody who quite frankly is a traditionalist and somebody that appreciates the rivalries in college football, it's about damn time that they finally play Missouri. They're going to be on the road versus Missouri this year, the first time they've played since 2011, and it's going to be for the first time where they actually kind of taste some power conference competition. Because if you look back and look at some of Kansas's schedules for the past maybe decade or so, they really haven't had too many power conference games where you legitimately sit there and say to yourself, hey, they have a real shot at winning this game. I mean, granted, Missouri, won 10 games last year. Eli Drakowitz, to me, is going to be one of those guys that is always going to be a threat, is somebody that's always going to have a super talented team, is somebody that can recruit anywhere within the country. But at the same time, too, this could be a real statement game for Kansas, too, because if they could sit there and pull off the upset versus Missouri and do that, I think a lot of people are going to sit there in what, quite frankly, is a really open Big 12 and say, hey, we know that we sit there and say every year that Kansas is on the precipice of something special. But I think, to me, this feels a little bit different. And I don't think there should be as much hype with Kansas as much as last year. I would say the general expectation probably is pretty similar to a Oklahoma State or a West Virginia, or maybe even Houston, where you sit there and say, hey, they probably have the potential to get that 8 or 9 win season. However, if you're going to be a little bit more conservative, you're probably going to sit there and say, hey, for a 7 or 8 win season and you don't get upsetted too much, you're probably sitting pretty and you're having a pretty solid season. But that's what's so difficult and so much fun about the Big 12 is a lot of these teams are always in very similar circumstances every year, especially from a geographical perspective. And you just remind yourself, too, that a lot of these programs have such rich history, too, but there's been so much change, particularly in the Big 12 over the past couple seasons. Now that they don't have Texas and Oklahoma, it just opens everything up so much more in terms of, Kansas being a threat, in terms of them, turning the page and not being so much of a basketball school, but an everything school. And they've invested the money into that. They got the right guy for the job. They have Jaylon Daniels. They have some returning guys, particularly on the offensive line, defensive line. There's still going to be in terms of the defensive side of the ball, particularly the secondary, and in terms of them not being as disciplined, particularly a lot of sloppy play and a lack of discipline. So I'm definitely kind of fascinated to see if that kind of comes to fruition.